My name is Sartini. I'm an English teacher, and welcome to my online classroom, a space where we read and analyze works of English literature to better understand how to live. Today, we're doing a summary and analysis of chapter number 2 in The Great Gatsby. Beginning with a summary, we're talking this chapter about Nick and Tom. Tom is taking Nick into Manhattan to go to his apartment. This apartment is shared between Tom and his mistress Myrtle, who we meet for the first time in this chapter. Now, you might be thinking, isn't Tom married to Daisy? You'd be correct. You'd also be correct in saying that Myrtle is married to a Mr. George Wilson, a mechanic. So these are two people in a relationship in which they're both cheating on their spouses. They are going to Tom is having this sort of weird party, a get-together of some sparse random people in this apartment. And there's a lot of talks about the relationship between Myrtle and Tom and how that kind of works, and how their marriages are failed, but they don't break up with their partners. They actually kind of like it that they're having an affair in a sense. They need it to continue their relationship, and how this whole theme of intimacy is portrayed in these fractured relationships. So that's our talk for today. Let's get started speaking about some quotes here. So the chapter begins by speaking of this place called the Valley of Ashes. So this story in itself, or rather like Gatsby's home, is in this place called East and West Egg, which is sort of in Long Island. And between Long Island, they have to go over a bridge into Manhattan. And as they're going over this bridge, kind of like the intermediary point between the glory of Manhattan and the quiet, calm serenity of Long Island, is this place called the Valley of Ashes. And it is explained like this. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke and, finally, with a transcendent effort of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery dirt. So, what is the Valley of Ashes? Well, I'm thinking it's this place where you receive, of course, ashes everywhere, and there's smokestacks, and there's massive industry, and there's just decay everywhere, and car parts, and there's maybe some used coal on the ground. I don't know how you can use coal without burning it, but that was probably a poor choice of words on my part. Anyway, a lot of poverty, a lot of construction going on there. And this kind of is a little bit different than what we saw in Chapter 1. Chapter 1, we're in these big Long Island, sprawling house, mansion, castle-looking like things, and now we're moving into sort of the real world, where we're away from the Mount Olympus, and we're going in and seeing the common folk. And the people that live here are the sort of manual laborers who keep society afloat. But are they respected individuals? Let's find out. Before we can talk about the people in this area and who lives there, the people, I would say, a representation of the manual laborer consciousness in this story is going to be George Wilson. Before we can talk about him, we have to talk about the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg, because in this Valley of Ashes sit a pair of glasses, an old sign. Quote, "The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which passed over a non-existent nose. Evidently, some wild wag of an occultist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many pointless days under sun and rain, broad on over the solemn dumping ground." Okay, so we've got these big pair of spectacles. They are yellow and looking out at the world. So it's kind of like the omnipotent eyes of God there. And it's just a pair of glasses in itself. So we're working with a symbol of glasses. It's not necessarily a fully constructed face. And these sort of eyes, it's like it's watching and it's judging the world around them. And it's also interesting because it talks about glasses, but also the symbol of eternal blindness, or forgot and moved away. So it's like the eyes of God are no longer watching, or the eyes of God are blind here. I know what it is. So it's God is blind here. So no one pays attention to the working class consciousness. No one pays attention to the lowest rungs of society in the time of the 1920s. We're all focused on hot jazz and going to these mansion parties and drinking illegally outside of prohibition laws. But what are the real people doing? What are the down-to-earth men and women who are building up society while the rich are playing? What are they really like there? And that's something that I want you to question when you're thinking about the 1920s is what was happening in the country that was more than just, money and fame and spending. Who were the people really like? Not just the rich, but the perhaps lower class, the ones that were building up the world for the rich to play in. And are they appreciated? Are they appreciated in modern times either? It's another question. Now, within this, we're going to see Mr. Wilson. So Mr. Wilson is the owner of a garage. He's the husband to Myrtle, and Tom is visiting him to buy a car, but really he's just taking his wife from him. And he lives in a garage that says, Garage, Repairs, George B. Wilson, Cars, Bought and Sold. It had occurred to me that the shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office wiping his hands on a piece of waste. So Mr. Wilson, he's a mechanic, he owns the shop, and it's even saying here again, like the Valley of Ashes is not watched over by God, it's that he is the lowest form of life, and then on top of that lies a sort of prestige over his garage, even in itself. So it's like he's the one that's holding up society so that the rich can be as affluent and as high-towering as they are. And the description of this person is, quote, he was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and fairly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into the light of his blue eyes. So this is a person who's very down to earth. He's working all day. He's rubbing his hands on waste. He's someone that is within the earth, working constantly all day. Now, this is a direct contrast to Tom, who we know peaked sort of in high school, or rather college, and hasn't done anything since. He actually doesn't even work. He just sort of travels and spends money on his polo horses and plays games still, whereas George Wilson is the inheritor of nothing but ashes, and this is an individual who has to work every day and strive for his wealth. He still has a certain beauty about him, this hopeful gleam in his blue eyes. But in reality, he's sort of stuck, and like you said, he's anemic. And there's this sort of death about him and where he lives. And then that's how the common folk are treated in this time, which is, again, the direct contrast, all of the rich and the wealth that are around him. And next, let's focus on his wife, which will be the main talking point of this chapter. His wife's name is Myrtle, and that is, quote, Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular cafes with her and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomever he knew. Now, it is interesting here that Tom sort of goes around and parades this woman around. He takes her away from George Wilson, and he's always in town at different parties and cafes and meeting and mingling new people. But it's interesting that he just sort of leaves Daisy at home. It seems like he never really takes Daisy out. This is more of his public figure, and everybody knows that he is with Daisy, but it's sort of like Daisy doesn't know he's cheating on her. But we know before Myrtle was calling during dinner, and Daisy's upset with that. So we do know that Daisy knows Tom is cheating on her, but why does she continue to allow that, or not necessarily bring it up as much? And then why isn't she necessarily taken to all of the fancy parties if she is one of these rich people in that social class, is a question I might have. And let's try to look a little bit more into this character of Myrtle. She's described as very attractive. She's described as, someone who is very interested in money and possessions. The first thing that Myrtle does is Tom and Myrtle and Nick, they're driving through the city, and she makes Tom buy a puppy, sort of Airedale, I believe is somewhat the breed, and they take it up to the apartment, and that's where it's going to be raised. So when I sort of see Daisy's like this beautiful bird that's in a cage, whereas Myrtle is maybe not the most exotic bird in the bunch, kind of just a generic person, but Tom seems to be able to spoil and pamper her in a way that he doesn't with Daisy, which is interesting. And I don't really know why that is as of yet. And let's see here. Then they go into this apartment that's focusing on the next scene, and we're learning that there's sort of just a bunch of people over, and they're hobnobbing back and forth and drinking. And Myrtle brings over her sister, who says the following about a different character of Gatsby, who we haven't met yet. She says, quote, they say he's a nephew or a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm's. That's where all his money comes from. I'm scared of him. I'd hate to have him get anything on me. So now we're focusing through this party, and there's that tone of Gatsby, and that name kind of comes up when they're all intermingling together. And it's said about Gatsby that he's so wealthy because he's the cousin of some German prince, king, warrior. I forget, Wilhelm. I'm so sorry. So he's got his money from being a wealthy inheritor. Now that's interesting because it brings up that notion again about inheritance, right? George Wilson, born from the ashes, will die in the ashes, inherits nothing. God is not with him. Whereas Tom has inherited everything, and fortune seems to have smiled upon him, but he doesn't really have any work ethic. He doesn't really have any purpose in the world. He doesn't have anything aside from Daisy and this mistress and some very expensive ponies. So it really, does Tom present a sort of well-rounded self, I wonder, if he inherited all he's worth? And that brings forth an interesting point of Gatsby, or I suppose the classical American allowance to inherit the fortunes of your deceased relatives, which I think is something very beautiful and we should protect in this country. But in terms of that, what does it say about Gatsby and Tom and George? Does it make them any more or less of a person? And everyone seems to be talking about Gatsby. In the last chapter, Jordan was whispering some rumors about his affluence and that she was actually one of the only people that knew him really legitimately, whereas this more seems like a genuine rumor. And we have to wonder about how that creates this persona of Gatsby, because he's this larger than life figure, but he's also away from everyone. So he's sort of a rogue that no one really knows anything about, but they would sure like to, but they can't seem to get close to him. And now they have to invent rumors about him, and no one's really sure what's true, and that's how his brand has been built over time. He's this mysterious, larger-than-life figure. And then sort of everybody in the room then begins to comment about the state of marriage in this world. And the sister of Myrtle, again, speaks about marriage in the following way. Quote, "Neither of them can stand the person they're married to. Can't they? Can't stand them." She looked at Myrtle and then at Tom. "What I say is, why go on living with them if they can't stand them? If I was them, I'd get a divorce and get married to each other right away." That's a great question. Thank you, Sister of Myrtle. So, Tom doesn't like Daisy, clearly. He's cheating on her. Myrtle clearly doesn't like George. She's cheating on him. Why don't they file divorces? Well, that goes back to the question of intimacy that I proposed in our beginning talk, which is, why can't people be intimate, or how do people be intimate effectively? But in this situation, we're seeing that actually Tom probably keeps Daisy around because he's unable to be intimate with another human being. He's unable to actually feel connection and feel love. So that's why he has a mistress. It's actually to keep Daisy at bay. It's not that he's willingly manipulating her and trying and forcefully like, oh, I'll cheat on you a bunch of times to keep you miserable. If he was doing that, he'd probably have multiple mistresses from all around the world. He's wealthy, he can do that. But he's specifically picking Myrtle because that's the way he feels himself comfortable. He can only feel comfortable with a person not when someone can care for him and share a life together, but rather when he keeps them at bay, at arm's length at all times. He has a problem getting close to people. I think Myrtle has that same sort of disability in relation to her husband. She doesn't want to be intimate with him either. And let's see if we can move through this a little bit more, this theme of intimacy here and the lack of it. It's really his wife that's keeping him apart. She's Catholic, and they don't believe in divorce. So his sister is saying that the reason that Tom and Daisy together, well, it's not Tom's fault. I mean, his wife just can't get a divorce because she's deeply religious. And then Nick sort of has this interesting comment saying, quote, "Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked with the elaborateness of the lie. When they do get married," continued Catherine, sister of Myrtle, "they're going west to live for a while until it blows over." So, interesting. There's this lie that perhaps Tom sort of tried to tell people. It says, oh, no, we can't get divorced because my wife is a certain faith and I don't want to insult her. But then Nick knows that's not true. And what does that actually say about Daisy? Like, who made up this lie first? Was it Daisy that made up the lie? Was it the sister that made up the lie? Was it the populace that makes up the lie? Is it Tom that made up the lie? If Tom makes up the lie, he's still trying to keep Daisy around. And he's still trying to keep Myrtle at the same time. So he's playing, obviously maybe you could say he loves both or wants to be with both. But if Daisy herself made up the lie, which would be ridiculous in this concept, so I don't know why I'm talking about it. But if the lie did come from her, it would sort of be like, well, I want Tom to be in my life, and maybe she wants to work things out, or maybe she needs Tom to stay at a certain distance. Maybe she even wants him to cheat on her, for example, so she doesn't feel that closeness either. And if the girl made up the lie, the sister? Well, of course she did, because she made up a lie about Gatsby before. So that brings the question, like, who do we trust in this world when Nick is going over this story? Are any of these characters really hopeful? Like Gatsby. Nick had said of Gatsby in the beginning, he turned out all right in the end. He was a representation of hope in the world. And we're looking to see that is sort of confirmed here, where the other individuals that Nick goes about with, they're liars, they're cheaters, they're manipulating constantly, all of these different situations. So that puts sort of Gatsby in a different frame even than the rest of them. So he's still seen as sort of, in a way, character. And moving on, the sister says, I almost married a little Jewish person who'd been after me for years. I knew he was below me. Everyone kept saying to me, Lucille, that man's way below you. But if I haven't met Chester, he'd have got me sure. Well, I married him, said Myrtle ambiguously, and that's the difference between your case and mine. I married him because I thought he was a gentleman, she said finally. I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. You were crazy about him for a while, said Catherine. Crazy about him, cried Myrtle incredulously. Who said I was crazy about him? I was never any more crazy about him than I was about that man there, pointing at Nick. The only crazy I was when I married him. I knew right away I made a mistake. He borrowed somebody's best suit to get married in and never even told me about it. And the man came after it one day when he was out. Oh, was that your suit? I said. That is the first I ever heard about it. But I gave it to him, and I laid down, cried, and beat the band all afternoon. She really ought to get away from him, resumed Catherine to me. They've been living over that garage 11 years, and Tom's the first sweetie she ever had. So, Myrtle's relationship with George is wild. So she was first like super madly in love with him. She's like, oh my God, this is a perfect person, knows a lot about breeding. And, even her sister's like, you were totally crazy about him. And she was like, well, I was crazy about him when I married him. But then I realized that he was poor. He was a loser. He didn't have his own clothes. He didn't have his own suit. I was only attracting him for money, but he doesn't have any. So I didn't care about him at all. And then I met Tom, who's got a lot of money, and now I feel secure. So this woman's attachments are nuts. She's clearly only dating George for his money. Maybe she thought that because he had his own business. But once she learned that he had none of that, he's not suitable enough for breeding. So she's only interested in being sort of treated like a princess, which she probably doesn't deserve. But that's the card that Tom can play in. So you could say that Tom selected her because of her desire to be pampered. So Tom, as I sort of alluded to, it doesn't, or perhaps may not be considered to have a self because he doesn't have any identity to predicate his worth on aside from his money. So when Myrtle can come along and adore him for only his money, he doesn't necessarily need to present any semblance of a personality to her. So that's another way to avoid intimacy, where he's staking all of his identity on his money. Myrtle is in love with the fact that he himself has money, but not him. So in a sense that they can avoid being sort of close enough and together, which is also why they don't get married or get divorces. So again, we're seeing a string of people who are unable to be attached or connected with one another, or that's the theme I'm trying to lay out for you here that I've seen. And then, this party's going on. There's a lot of drinking, and Nick is sort of fading out. And then this happens. Quote, sometime toward midnight, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face discussing, in impassioned voices, whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. Interesting. So we've got a couple of different things I would like to talk about here. So night's going on, and, Tom was always getting in a fight with somebody. Now it's Myrtle. And Myrtle, of course, or what I'm assuming here, is starting to bring up the concept of Daisy. Maybe she's saying, well, you should divorce her and get with me, honey. I'm so great, we're in love and all. And Tom clearly doesn't want to do that because he does this. Daisy, 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 shouted Miss Wilson. I'll say it whenever I want. Daisy, Making a short, daft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. Slapped her, snapped her nose, right? So anytime that Myrtle brings up the reality that he's still with Daisy or references her, Tom beats her and breaks her. Interesting. So I would, you could call this an abusive relationship, but Tom seems to have abusive relationships with anybody when they seem to bring up the reality, right? Daisy probably brought up that Tom was cheating on her before, so he broke her pinky, and now Tom breaks Myrtle's face open when he mentions the other girl. So anytime that sort of a reality is set in, or anytime that a sort of connection is brought up that Tom has, it seems that's when he gets physically violent. He doesn't want to hear about it. So any sort of, again, connection that is brought up is broken in this world. And Nick is seeing that. And he's also, Nick has an interesting way of relaying the situation, because through this entire chapter, he calls Myrtle not by her name, but rather Mrs. Wilson. I don't know what that means, but I found it very different from the other characters, because he can call Daisy by name, he can call Tom, his full name, Tom Buchanan, but he only calls Myrtle by her last name. He even makes a note about this, that the only time he felt comfortable enough to call her by her first name was after they had drank a little bit together, but then he goes back to Mrs. Wilson. So I wonder why it is that Nick does that. Does he really want to make a point as the narrator observing the situation that, Myrtle is, somebody else's girl and that she's taken? Why would Scott F. Fitzgerald choose to make that specific claim, or to make Nick relate to Mrs. Wilson or Myrtle in that way? Why does she get special treatment there? And again, we're seeing sort of that this is all about lack of intimacy, right? Like even Nick himself seems to, perhaps you could say, using this as an example, have a lack of intimacy with people, because he's only using the last name of this woman and addressing her by her married name rather than her first name. So that's sort of my discussion about this chapter. I really wanted to dig into this concept of intimacy and to just paint you a map that basically everyone that Nick observes is, again, lying, cheating, manipulating, spreading rumors. No one really gets a chance to get close to each other. And whenever a reality of a connection, or a connection that someone is supposed to have, is mentioned, Tom breaks their nose, breaks their finger. So there's a lot of violence that's related to when people get close. And we can see pretty much every scene that people do sort of hang out, it's always drinking and there's alcohol involved. And that's maybe putting people in this sort of like delirium in which, again, they're so uncomfortable being around each other that they can't even do it soberly. They have to use substances in order to take their attention away from even being in the same room together. So all of these relationships are essentially a mess. And that leaves the question, well, the book is called The Great Gatsby, so where's Gatsby? I think Scott F. Fitzgerald's done a really good job of laying in the mythos of Gatsby first. I don't remember if we meet him next chapter or not. It's been a while since I've read this. But basically, he's laying out this character of Gatsby as Nick claims him to be hopeful. And I think a reason why he describes him as hopeful is because Nick's world, again, is filled with these liars and cheaters. So he's something above them. And sometimes he's described as like sort of like nefarious in a sense, like he's the spawn of a German count, and he's embezzled money perhaps, or But Jordan's like, no, I kind of know him, but no one really does. So he's someone that is still in his own camp away from the world, so he's lacking a connection, but he's not one of these sleazy New York Manhattan people. And he's also not someone like Mr. Wilson, in which he's embedded in the belly of ashes. He's something different. And I think that sort of rogue, removed from society, or removed from this deceptional sort of relationships, I think that's been very well established. So I'm interested to see what the character of Gatsby is portrayed like moving forward. And I was curious to ask you a question. What do you think his total vision is going to be look like? Do you think he's going to be like a real deal? Did he make his money on his own? Is he a well-traveled man? Is he the prince of Germany somehow? How did he get his money? And then how does the way you gain money throughout your lifetime, or your inheritance, how much does your inheritance affect your future and your personality and development as a self? Those are some of the key questions I want to ask you. You're more than welcome to answer with your own perspective in the comments below. Thanks so much for joining us for our talk on Chapter 2, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye.